Good morning. Before we talk about property law today, I have something else I'd like to discuss. It's going to take a little bit of time, but I think it's important. And so I hope you'll bear with me while I lecture for a little bit. I've already introduced you to my kids. Today, I'd like to introduce you to another member of my family. These are my parents, my kids' grandparents. That's my mom. My mother. My mother was born in the Kingdom of Iraq in 1952. She was born into a Jewish community that had persisted in the city now known as Baghdad for 2,600 years. Excuse me. The Jews of Iraq claim direct descent from the Judeans of the Babylonian Exile, which was recounted in the Old Testament's second book of Kings and dated by modern scholars to the early 6th century BCE. When the Persian king Cyrus the Great conquered Babylon approximately 2 generations later, he allowed the Judeans to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their temple as recounted in the Old Testament books of Ezra and Nehemiah. But Babylon was a rich city, and a sizable community of Judeans remained there, where they created what we now recognize to be the Jewish faith. Their scholars wrote the Babylonian Talmud, a guide to practicing their monotheistic faith without access to ritual sacrifice at the deity's temple. And their work became more authoritative to world Judaism than the Talmud prepared in Jerusalem. Jews in Babylon, later renamed Baghdad, had an uneasy place as a separate and distinct community under Assyrian, then Persian, then Hellenist, then Islamic, then Ottoman rule. But they prospered as service workers, as merchants, as financiers, even as government bureaucrats and ministers. My grandfather's family were cloth merchants. They did well. They grew wealthy. My grandfather had a fine house. He built a synagogue for his community. The man in the tall fez in the center of this photo is Yechezkel Sasson. He was a highly regarded member of the Baghdadi Jewish community and the first finance minister of the Kingdom of Iraq. The man with the dark beard sitting to Sasson's right is Faisal I, the first king of Iraq, a new state constituted out of the rubble of the Ottoman Empire after World War I by jostling European powers. Over the course of the 20th century, relations between Muslims and Jews in the Middle East became increasingly strained over the movement for a Jewish national home in Palestine, culminating in the declaration of the State of Israel and a series of wars and occupations that rack the region to this day. The first of those wars in 1948 was followed by a wave of persecution of Iraqi Jews. Not long after, in 1950, the government of Iraq passed a law to allow Jews to emigrate to the new State of Israel, the attempt of which would ordinarily be a crime punishable by 7 years imprisonment. But to take advantage of this dispensation, Jews would have to surrender their Iraqi citizenship and all of their property. And the privilege to emigrate legally under these conditions would only be available for 1 year. The government of Iraq believed that of the country's roughly 130,000 Jews, at most 10,000 of them would leave. The remainder, most people thought, would be unwilling to give up their prosperous lives, their property, and the only home their families had ever known for an uncertain future in a precarious country. They had it exactly backwards. Nearly the entire Jewish population of Iraq, 120,000 people, left the country between 1950 and 1951. Leaving behind the only lives they and their families had known for 26 centuries. But not my mother. She was in my grandmother's womb in 1951. And my grandfather was not willing to give up his successful business and risk a strenuous emigration to a struggling new country with his 6 children and a pregnant wife. He had a brother who ran a branch of the family business in London, which held out the hope of a future escape if things got too bad, and so they stayed in Baghdad. My mother was born. But things continued to get worse. By the time she was 5, with most of the Jewish community gone, and what remained under constant threat, my grandparents were exploring options to flee the country. They planned an extended vacation for their family to Geneva, to London, and to New York. They took very little with them to avoid raising suspicion that they intended to emigrate unlawfully. One of my uncles stayed behind in Baghdad to mind the family store. My mother, her sister, and her 4 other brothers took up what they thought was a temporary residence in New York City. And my grandparents returned to Baghdad for what they expected would be a short stay to satisfy the authorities, to set their affairs in order, and to make a final decision one way or another about immigration. During that short return to Baghdad, and please be warned, the next slide is somewhat graphic, so please feel free to look away. During my grandparents' brief return to Baghdad, there was a coup in Iraq, the coup of 1958. The royal family and the prime minister were murdered. Their mutilated corpses hung from balconies and dragged through the streets. My grandparents and my one uncle, who had remained in Baghdad to mind the store, were trapped in a country on fire. My mother, then 5 years old, wouldn't see or hear from her parents for the next 3 years. In the meantime, she had a new home, this house. This house is on Aberdeen Road in Queens. It is only a few blocks from where I am now a tenured professor at St. John's University. I took this picture 8 years ago on my way home from work. The brother in London, my mother's uncle, was able to help. He flew in from time to time to bring money to sign legal papers. But aside from that, my mother and her siblings raised themselves. Her oldest brother, my uncle, was the man of the house. He was 19 years old. He had been at boarding school in England since before my mother was born. They met on the way to New York for the first time. My aunt, the lady of the house, was 15 years old. For 3 years, they raised themselves in Queens. My mother went to school. At 5 years old, she started to learn English. She spoke 3 languages, but English wasn't one of them. These children, my mother, my aunt, my uncles, made a home for themselves in this house, in this city, in this country. And one day they got a telephone call. My grandparents and my uncle had managed to escape to Switzerland. They were on their way to the United States. Along the way, my grandmother brought presents for her children, but they were for the children of her memory, 3 years younger than her actual children. They were presents for this girl. My mother remembers that there were clothes for her, but they were all too small, except for one dress that my grandmother bought because she thought that it was so beautiful she could hold on to it until my mother grew big enough to wear it. It was the only thing that fit. When my grandparents came to New York to rejoin their children after their own Babylonian exile, they flew into Idlewild Airport. My mother and her siblings met their parents in the terminal. My oldest uncle made them wait to greet their parents one at a time because he was worried that seeing them all at once after so long a separation would be too much strain on my grandmother's heart. A few years later, Idlewild Airport would be renamed for a recently fallen president. You know this airport as JFK. This weekend, a number of people born, like my mother, in Iraq or in one of 6 other countries in the region arrived at JFK Airport from overseas. Some of them arrived after going through a lengthy process to obtain legal refugee status from the United States government and to be resettled in the United States. Others are lawful permanent residents of the United States returning home after traveling abroad who happen to be born in one of these 7 countries. Others are visitors who obtain temporary visas in compliance with our country's laws. On Friday evening, January 27th, 2017, the current occupant of the office of the Presidency of the United States signed an executive order that purported to bar these people from entry into the country for varying periods of time. 90 days for people born in one of the 7 identified countries, 120 days for all legal refugees wherever born, and for refugees born in Syria indefinitely. This order caused many people with duly issued visas to enter the United States to be refused boarding in their ports of origin as their visas were suddenly revoked. Most visibly, it resulted in detention and, in some cases, deportation by federal agents at U.S. airports of an indeterminate number of people whose permission to enter the United States was revoked while they were in transit, while they were in the air. The order of January 27th has sparked massive protests at JFK and other ports of entry throughout the United States. Perhaps some of you participated in one or more of these protests this weekend. Perhaps others of you support the executive order, or at least its intent. I do not intend to argue the merits of the order of January 27th with you today. Instead, I want to make 2 points. The first is that this matters. Had it been in effect 58 years ago, the order of January 27th would have resulted in the exclusion of my 5-year-old mother or her parents or her siblings from the United States, and their return to Iraq, where their lives would have been in immediate and constant danger. I would not be here today. My children would not be here today. My family, all of us, owe our lives to immigration policies that diverge in meaningful ways from the policy of the order of January 27th, and we are not unique. Today, there are millions of people in the 7 countries specified in the order of January 27th, and millions of refugees around the world who face far worse dangers than my mother did in Baghdad in 1958. Whether or not these people are permitted to resettle in the United States as refugees, or to enter the United States as temporary visitors, or to return to their adopted home in the United States as lawful permanent residents, is a matter of life and death for many of them. And unless you're a Native American, in which case you have an even more gruesome family history, there is an immigration story like my mother's somewhere in your past, maybe even in your own life story. I encourage you to learn that story, if you don't already know it. Because we, all of us, have reason to be immensely grateful for the fact that we or our ancestors were able to immigrate to the United States. And we therefore have reason to take seriously and personally any policy that purports to alter the ability of others to do so. Excuse me. When I say that this matters, I mean that whatever goals are sought to be achieved with the policy such as that embodied in the executive order of January 27th, this is what they're stacked up against. And again, I don't mean to argue the appropriate balance of those considerations on the merits with you today. You may believe the order is appropriate. You may believe that the order is inappropriate. And I do not mean to try to change your mind. I want to end with a different point, though. I want to end on the question whether the executive order of January 27th is lawful and what it means to ask that question in the United States. When the order of January 27th was signed, it was bound to have some consequences in the world because it issued from the office of the President of the United States. But what those consequences would be could not be finally determined by the office of the President of the United States. In the first instance, if sufficient majorities of Congress disagree with the policy of the order of January 27th, they have the power to reverse that policy by statute. But more to the point for today, when federal agents act under the authority of the order of January 27th to detain or to exclude or to remove people previously granted permission to enter into the United States, those people may have a right to challenge their detention, their exclusion, or their removal as unlawful or as unconstitutional. And the only reason that such a right means anything is because somewhere there is a lawyer who can argue their case to a judge who is sworn to fairly and impartially hear it. I'm talking about these lawyers who set up a makeshift law office on the floor of Terminal 1 at JFK to draft petitions for writs of habeas corpus on behalf of foreign-born travelers they had never met. I am also talking about government lawyers who are called into court late at night on a moment's notice and are obligated to argue the best case they can, consistent with their ethical and their constitutional obligations to uphold an act of the government they are sworn to serve. Because when there is a question of life and death in the United States, we do not want it to be decided by chance or by whim or by the might of the strongest. We demand that it be decided according to an equal application of the law. And for that to happen, we need lawyers. Now, lawyers alone are not going to be sufficient to ensure that the things that matter are decided according to the law. But they are absolutely necessary. We need good lawyers. We need responsible, creative, committed, persistent, ethical, professional lawyers. That is what we need you to be. That is why you are here. That is what we, your professors, are preparing you to do. It is why we do what we do. The practice of law is a noble profession, and don't ever let anybody tell you any differently. I believe in it. I believe in it because everything good in my life depends on it. We're going to take our 5-minute break early today. Please take 5 minutes now. We'll come back and return to our discussion of property law. We have a lot of work to do.